Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to the webinar this afternoon. I'm Christian Turton, and I'm the EdTech Demonstrator lead at Sandringham School. I'll tell you a bit more about the school in a moment. This afternoon's webinar has a range of different sections in it. We're going to look at blended learning, but one of the real focuses is looking at the virtual learning curriculum or remote learning that we've been doing at Sandringham School. So the main section of the webinar this afternoon is from our deputy head teacher, talking about the programme that we've had. Now there are some live sections where I'll be talking and some pre-recorded sections as well. So some people have recorded sections for this, and I'll run that when we get to it. So just a little bit of an introduction. So Sandringham School is a large secondary comprehensive academy in Hertfordshire with over 1,600 students and a large sixth form as well. So obviously outstanding since 2008-9, and we also have the world-class schools quality mark. Won't go through all the performance data there. So EdTech at Sandringham. Sandringham's had a Bring Your Own Device programme since 2014. So all students in Key Stage 3 and 4 have tablet devices, and in the sixth form, students make a lot of use of laptops and Chromebooks. We've called it blended learning because really it's about having a mixture of traditional and more modern approaches to learning. So teachers are empowered with information on the latest research and through professional development to make choices about when it's best to use technology and when they might not want to use technology. And there's been a particular emphasis on extending the school day and allowing kind of anytime, anywhere learning outside of the school through the use of mobile devices. And of course, there's been a lot of things that have been put into place for the blended learning programme to work, including considering how students use them during the day, when they're allowed to use them, and updating the behaviour policy, for example. Research has been really important in how we use technology as well. So we're also an Education Endowment Foundation research school. We're part of that network of schools, and the research behind blended learning has been incredibly important to us in ensuring that what we're doing with technology is right and that there's some evidence that it's going to work. This webinar and these presentations are part of the EdTech Demonstrator programme, and this is a national programme funded by the Department for Education. So the URL here is where you would go to register your interest in being supported by a school. You can request a school, and it might be possible for you to be matched with that school. So you can ask, for example, to work with Sandringham if you would like to. But that's the URL to visit to request to fill in the expression of interest form. We've also got a website, Sandagogy, which has a section for the EdTech Demonstrator School on it. And you can find out about upcoming webinars, for example, and case studies, for example, looking at how we've used technology, and remote learning evidence-informed pedagogy guides as well. So you can look at some of the research behind the use of technology and pedagogies that you can use in a remote learning context. As I mentioned, we've got a case study section there, so you can hear about how some of our teachers have been teaching during remote learning. And Fergal will be speaking about that shortly in his presentation. And also, so I mentioned the research to inform pedagogy guides as well, and our research school has been blogging to extend on some of that information in those guides also. So that's just a brief introduction from me. What I will do just now is run a video that we've made recently with our assistant head teacher, Mark Allday, talking about the blended learning programme at Sandringham. So it's about 3 minutes, just so you can take a look at that. Throughout, please feel free to ask questions just by typing them in the chat window in the bottom right-hand corner, and I can address those either via the chat or when I come on in between some of the pre-recorded sections to talk.
Our journey with the use of tablet devices to support and enhance learning began back in 2011. Initially, this was with a school-owned set of iPads. The 2-year pilot saw over 3,000 learning hours being delivered using these devices across all key stages and all subjects. The Bring Your Own Device trials were initially rolled out to Year 7 in the summer of 2014. This later became a requirement for the whole of Key Stage 3 and 4 as part of school policy. The rationale behind implementing the scheme was to allow for a greater degree of personalisation and independence, to engage students and to lessen their dependence on their teacher. All pupils in Key Stage 3 and 4 now have portable devices, and Key Stage 5 students have a laptop depending on their A-level or vocational study options. During the academic year 2014, this was the year before the rollout of the Bring Your Own Device programme, the CPD and training offer across the school focused on upskilling staff with the digital competencies and knowledge of the tools and pedagogical approaches that they needed to continue to develop outstanding learning opportunities for students across the school. Alongside this formal training offer, we drip-fed ideas to staff through our Sandringham Teaching and Learning blog, weekly teaching tips, and inviting educational experts such as Mark Anderson to work alongside our staff. A unique element of our Bring Your Own Device scheme is that students and their families get to choose which device is most suitable for them to bring to school. This could be a tablet that they currently own, or one that they purchase as they begin in Year 7. The only stipulation from the school surrounds screen size and a rear-facing camera. Obviously, as there is freedom of choice for families, the learning activities and the tools that are utilised for those, such as apps and subscriptions, need to be platform agnostic and cannot rely on, for example, iOS-only apps. I'm very proud to say that our Bring Your Own Device scheme is truly inclusive, and we offer a device loan scheme for students in receipt of pupil premium funding or other families who require additional financial help. Nobody is disadvantaged. Through our research, the school has adopted the term blended learning to describe a best of both approach to teaching and learning. Blended learning retains all of the effective elements of traditional teacher-led classroom instruction, such as a focus on written work, literacy, numeracy and oracy, but skillfully weaves in digital technologies, portable devices, online resources and collaborative learning when it is suitable, but most importantly, will enhance learning. The backbone of our Bring Your Own Device programme focuses on the use of the Google for Education suite of tools. Google Classrooms are automatically created at the start of each academic year for teachers and students to use throughout. Staff are asked to upload all digital content from their lessons to Classroom so students can access this both in and beyond the classroom. Students are also given unlimited cloud storage space on Google Drive, making storage on the device itself less of an issue. Our blended learning toolkit encapsulates some of the key applications commonly used across the school. This resource is freely downloadable to all key stakeholders on both our school website and our Sandringham Teaching and Learning blog.
Okay, so a quick introduction there to the Bring Your Own Device programme that we have at Sandringham School. So as Mark said in that video also, quite importantly, we have a Bring Your Own Device programme, and that's something that's worked really well for the demographic that we have in our school. But there's certainly something to be said for having programmes where the same device is used throughout the school, and the school has kind of ownership of it. But this is what works best for us. And also, as Mark mentioned, students on pupil premium are provided with a device. We sometimes put a small charge there to kind of give sense of ownership over the programme, over the device. But yeah, they are provided with devices as well. So I'm just going to move on now. I mentioned that the research has been quite important behind our programme. So I'd just like to go over to our Deputy Head Teacher Caroline Creeby now, just again with a pre-recorded video to talk about the programme in relation to research and what the research says about digital technologies. And in particular, you may be familiar with the Education Endowment Foundation report, and this is really interesting, and a lot of the research that's come out of the EEF can be really interesting as well. It's probably important to say also that technology plays a role in a lot of the higher impact strategies that can be found in the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit as well. So let's have a look at this from Caroline Creeby, a short presentation looking at the research behind the blended learning and virtual learning curriculum at Sandringham.
Welcome to this section on the research evidence underpinning both blended learning and virtual learning at Sandringham. I'm Dr. Caroline Creeby, Deputy Head Teacher and Research School Director. In our experience, the research evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation has been particularly helpful. So, who are the EEF? The EEF is an independent charity dedicated to breaking the link between family income and educational achievement. And the EEF roots all of its work in breaking this link in the best available evidence. Given all their breadth and depth of knowledge on education research, the EEF were a natural place for us to look when considering our approach to blended learning. The EEF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit was particularly helpful in this regard, which showed how the evidence on digital technology was secure. Now, by digital technology, the EEF mean the use of computers and technology to support learning in schools. Approaches in this area vary widely, but generally involve technology for students, where they use programs or apps designed for, say, problem solving or open-ended learning. And it also covers technology for teachers, such as whiteboards or learning platforms. The EEF's toolkit gives us an insight into the costs. You'll see here that there are 3 pound sign icons highlighted out of a total of 5, indicating that the cost is moderate. A key component of such costs isn't actually the hardware that might already be in place in schools, like the whiteboards or the laptops, but rather it's the additional training and support that teachers need in order to make the most of digital technology to support learning more effectively. The evidence in this area is strong, indicated by the 4 out of 5 security padlocks being highlighted. There is extensive evidence of a positive effect across different age groups, for example, in the research and most areas of the curriculum. However, the variation in impact and the range of technologies available suggests that it is always important to monitor the impact of learning in any new approach using technology. Now, the pace of educational change means that evidence is usually about yesterday's technology rather than today's. But average effects have remained consistent for some time, which suggests that the general message of, on average, that there are positive impacts from digital technology, that they're likely to remain relevant. So, according to the EEF, how effective is digital technology? Well, the toolkit indicates that on average, there can be gains of 4 additional months' progress for students. Evidence suggests that technological approaches should be used to supplement teaching rather than to replace more traditional approaches. It is unlikely that particular technologies will bring about changes in learning directly, but some have the potential to enable changes in teaching and learning interactions. So, for example, they can support teachers to provide more effective feedback or use more helpful representations or models, for example. And also, technology can help to motivate students to practice more. And I suppose this is why we found the evidence from the EEF on digital learning so powerful, because not only can it be helpful in itself, but actually it can provide a gateway to enable other aspects of teaching and learning that are so powerful. If we look at the screen here, we have feedback and metacognition, which are 2 areas that have a significant scope to enhance learning. And what we understood from the EEF was that actually utilising a blended learning approach, i.e. incorporating digital technology into our teaching, would help us not only see learning gains through the use of digital technology, but through our enhanced feedback or supporting students more effectively to develop their metacognitive skills. Another key piece of evidence that I would recommend looking at is the EEF's guidance report on digital learning, which contains a really helpful set of recommendations based on the available research. The 4 recommendations set out in the reports are here. The first is consider how technology will improve teaching and learning before introducing it. The second is technology can be used to improve the quality of explanations and modelling. The third is technology offers ways to improve the impact of pupil practice. And the fourth and final one is technology can play a role in improving assessment and feedback. What is clear then about these recommendations is they do not recommend technology for technology's sake, but rather support effective teaching, enabling teachers to model, students to practice, and teachers to feedback more efficiently or effectively than otherwise might have been possible. The Teaching and Learning Toolkit and the Digital Learning Guidance Report are just two sources of research evidence, but two I would recommend to colleagues in other schools looking at developing their approach to blended learning. Having looked at this research evidence surrounding blended learning, I'll now move on to the research evidence that has influenced our approach to virtual teaching since schools closed in England. The EEF published a really helpful rapid evidence review on distance learning in April. In it, there were 5 recommendations based upon the best available international evidence. It is worth noting, however, that the evidence is drawn from diverse contexts across the world and doesn't necessarily parallel our current situation exactly. The first recommendation is quality is more important than how lessons are delivered when it comes to teaching. This clearly emphasizes the primacy of teaching quality above the particular platform or technological approach. The fundamentals of quality explanation, modelling, scaffolding and feedback need to be in place in order for students to learn. The second recommendation relates to access to technology, particularly for disadvantaged students. It is those students that are less likely to have access to a device or broadband at home, for example, and so there is significant concern in the sector about the likely widening of the disadvantaged attainment gap. The international evidence identified that access to technology did act as a significant barrier for learning for these students. And on to the third recommendation, which centres on peer interactions. As teachers, we know that peers can be a powerful source of learning and support in our classrooms. But of course, this is very difficult to recreate whilst we're all learning miles apart in our own homes. Considering ways in which students can collaborate, teachers can share model work from peers, provide opportunities for peer assessment, and how to recreate discussions through online live lessons all have potential to harness peer interaction. The fourth recommendation centres on students being able to work independently. Students will get stuck, and I'm sure we've all found they will struggle at times to remain on top of their work. Metacognitive strategies, therefore, can be particularly powerful to support learning. Helping students how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning could prove particularly helpful at this time, along with tools like daily checklists to help students remain on top of their work and incorporate other aspects of healthy lifestyles into their days. The fifth recommendation will speak to all teachers, I'm sure, that different approaches to remote learning will suit different ages of students and different subjects. Sandringham is a secondary school, and I know that the approaches teachers are taking vary according to their subject. We will come to case studies later in this webinar, but they do powerfully demonstrate the different approaches teachers are taking depending on the needs of their students and the curriculum. Hopefully then this section has given you a brief overview of some of the research evidence that has influenced practice here at Sandringham School. All of the evidence and resources I've referred to in this section are freely available on the EEF's website. Here's the web address. Once on the site, click on Evidence Summaries to get to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. Click on Practical School Tools to download the free guidance report. And click on COVID-19 resources to download the evidence on distance learning, along with a lot of other helpful resources to use at this time. But before wrapping up, it's important to say that when it comes to research evidence, it's about what's the best fit for you and your school. It is challenging to act on even one aspect of the evidence faithfully, and so it's important to be selective, to review what you're doing at the moment and to carefully select a key priority for your students in your school, and then be guided by the evidence and by your professional judgment. Thank you for listening.
Okay, and that guidance report that Caroline was just referring to at the end there, we found incredibly useful. And it was really interesting that it's not so much the model of delivery, but the effectiveness of teaching that is particularly important. And so we've really focused, and you'll see in some of our case studies, if you go and have a look at those, that we focused on the effective parts of teaching. So, for example, being able to give feedback, giving actionable feedback during lockdown, conducting formative assessment so we know where our students are at and adjusting what we're teaching based on that. And also we've been delivering live lessons regularly through Google Meet. We use G Suite for Education at our school. So I'm going to move on now to the main part of this presentation, really, which is our Deputy Head Teacher, Fergal Moan, talking about how to design a remote learning curriculum, but also talking about our experience and what we've done with remote learning. So I'm just going to move over to Fergal's presentation now, which is, like I said, the main part of this presentation. And then please do type any questions as we're going through in the chat window. Very happy to answer those. And we'll also have a short section on the case studies from Caroline Creeby as we come to the end of the presentation after Fergal has spoken. Okay.
Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Designing a Remote Learning Curriculum. My name is Fergal Moan. I'm Deputy Head Teacher at Sandringham School in St Albans, and we are one of the National EdTech Demonstrator schools supported by the DFE. So before we get started into the main bulk of the presentation, there's a couple of definitions worth being aware of. That's remote learning and blended learning, and it's very pertinent at the moment with some children in school and some working remotely and working at home. So remote learning is when teacher and student can't be in the same physical space and time, so can't meet in a classroom setting. And blended learning is really interweaving classroom-based traditional teaching and methodologies and tools, along with remote learning tools such as virtual classrooms, learning platforms, apps, quizzes, simulations, web research, and things like that. So blended learning is really the best of both worlds, but may be used particularly in this context with the COVID lockdown of looking at being a bridging approach between periods when you may be able to see students on site physically and periods where they may be learning remotely, and the student has some control over the time and the place that they do that learning. So in terms of determining a strategy for remote learning, the first thing to do is assess your starting point. And you may not know this, but there actually is a national strategy around educational technology. So it was published by the Department of Education last year. And it's a useful document, but in summary, the diagram really indicates sort of considerations that we need to think about in terms of looking at our starting point. So you see there that really the considerations are around infrastructure, skills, safety, and procurement. So thinking first of all, what infrastructure do your students have and do your teachers have? So do they have a means of access, laptops, tablets, etc.? What about broadband, particularly for students, particularly for those that are disadvantaged, maybe not have broadband at home, or maybe sharing devices across multiple family members, or maybe the only device in the house at the moment is a mobile phone. And then thinking about, is there an infrastructure in place around a learning platform? So two common learning platforms are Google's G Suite or Microsoft's Office 365 combined with Teams. Then thinking about skills, so where are we in terms of both students and teachers around digital learning and education technology? Are we starting from quite a low base where this is all going to be new to staff and students, or is the tools are already in wide use, and maybe there's an evolution there that can be made upon existing practices rather than a revolution. Thinking about e-safety, again, both for staff and students, so we clearly have duties around safeguarding, and I know that there are some concerns around things like live video conferences and recorded materials being distributed electronically to students, but we'll talk later about reasonably straightforward ways to mitigate those and to risk assess accordingly. And then thinking about procurement, we talked about infrastructure and potentially a digital divide. So what options do you have as a school for managing to either procure equipment or distribute equipment to students? So I suppose the main real instruction from this is start by building upon what you have rather than a big new technology deployment at this stage. Managing to communicate with students and staff and train people remotely is quite challenging as it is. So really your start point should determine the strategy, because a wide-scale rollout of a new multi-year plan and program might be quite difficult to do when we're in the remote lockdown and learning period. So then thinking about vision and strategy. So once we've looked at issues around planning and start points, the next thing is, what do you want to get from this whole operation? What are the learning goals for your plans? And do these learning goals vary by year group? So is there a prioritization within year groups or between year groups? And thinking about their ability to self-regulate and ability to work independently, that certainly varies across different year groups. Then thinking also about staff availability and workload. So although there is a misconception in the public around live lessons being of higher value than pre-recorded or offline lessons, asynchronous lessons, you may not be able to deliver a full live program if staff are shielding or have care duties, or childcare means that they cannot be at their laptop at specific times of the day. So you need to think about what can be done with the staffing that you have available. You have to think about whether you followed the existing timetable. So advantage there is obviously when staff are available and they're allocated to classes that they have probably been teaching at the early part of this year. Or do you look at a collapsed timetable or some kind of team approach where a subgroup of teachers take the lead on teaching year 7, another group on year 8, some on site, some versus preparing materials for off site. Do you look at core subjects as a priority? Do you think about options as a subsequent thing? So we mentioned a little bit around this earlier. So thinking about a mix of live lessons and synchronous and asynchronous. So if we've got some students who are going to be on site, how can we bridge the learning between those encounters with their teachers or with their tutors on site? And if we are looking at offline lessons predominantly, how do we sustain social contact with our students if we're not able to convene them in a virtual class environment on a live basis? Also think about your expectations around assessment and feedback. Students do recognize the value of getting feedback to help them improve, and really it's around motivation too. If they are submitting work and never getting any feedback on it, that motivation will clearly decline over time. So think about the workflow that's be necessary there for staff to be able to collect that and mark it and feedback to students efficiently. Also think about considerations for examination groups. So year 10 and 12 at this time, what are expectations around things like mock exams or end of unit assessments? Can those be done electronically, or is that more hassle than it's worth, and really assessments should be deferred at this point? Training for staff and students. There is a myth out there about students being digital natives, so they don't need to be trained. Not true. If you've ever seen a year 7 struggle with setting up Google Classroom or Show My Homework, they do need to be guided and shown what to do with digital learning tools in particular. They may know their way around Snapchat, but that doesn't necessarily help them with schoolwork. And likewise with staff, there will be different levels of comfort and confidence amongst the staff body. So thinking about how remote training can be delivered to staff at this time. Thinking about online safety, we mentioned already, there are obviously concerns around, conduct of students online, potentially screenshotting or, making disclosures, things like that to in one-to-one settings with teachers that need to be managed, and there needs to be an adjustment to safeguarding policies to take account of this. And finally, then thinking about how we can engage parents, how we can communicate with parents around what's the plan overall, what the individual pieces of work are, if we want them to be involved with that, or more around reassuring them about how they can best support their students at home. And really it's a consideration about how much information you want to share, how involved you want them to be. And again, that may vary with year group, with the older years potentially being more independent and the younger years needing more support. One thing to give consideration to is that if we are relying on the students to pass on messages to parents, they can sometimes be distorted. It's not unusual for a student to say to their parent, I have no work to do today, and that turns out to be a barefaced lie, because in reality they just don't want to do the work. So we need to think about how we can communicate both directly and indirectly with parents. Then thinking about practices that we know work, so evidence-informed practices to support remote learning. So hopefully you may have seen that the Education Endowment Foundation undertook a rapid evidence assessment looking at the existing research to support the remote learning of students. And the great thing about this is it's on the ES website and is a short report that's easily digestible, and really is a meta study of the research that's out there, but really tailored towards thinking about the UK education system. So EF came up with 5 recommendations around what the evidence shows around remote learning. And the first one is possibly the most important to get across to students and parents, that teaching quality and lesson design and instruction design is far more important than how lessons are delivered. Again, we have to really guard against this overvaluing of live lessons. They definitely have a place. It definitely has a role in providing some direct instruction to students and socializing them and really maintaining that link with students that are working remotely. But in reality, a asynchronous lesson, an offline lesson that has superior thought in terms of resources, differentiation, the assessment and feedback will be better than a poorly designed ramble through an hour-long conference call where teaching and learning has not been adjusted and practices are not adjusted to work in the remote environment. And this is something that I think could be shared with parents or with governors to explain the rationale around the mix of pedagogy that you come up with. Ensuring access to technology is key, especially with disadvantaged students, so having particular plans in place to equip those students, ensure they have access to broadband. Easier said than done. I know many of us are delighted with the idea that the DfE were distributing laptops and 4G routers, but many of us have yet to receive those, and it certainly hasn't covered the whole population as far as it might. So it may be that you need to draw upon school resources to be able to support this. One possible recommendation is exploring the refurbished market, where if funds are tight in schools, clearly we understand that, but we've been able to, in some of our schools in our trust, secure Chromebook devices for just over £100 that are refurbished Acer devices that work very well for disadvantaged students. Thinking about peer interaction and creating conditions for classes to behave like classes. So thinking about where students can peer assess, can contribute via collaborative projects to look at organizing group work and shared objectives can really help with motivation. Thinking about independent learning as well. So students are obviously working in an isolated way at the moment if they're working remotely, and then thinking about specific support to foster their independent learning skills is an important aspect of successful remote learning. And then finally, just being cognizant that different approaches to remote learning suit different types of content and different types of students as well. And it could be to do with their age, but it could also be to do with other factors such as SEND. And we need to give consideration to differentiation even when we're thinking about remote learning. Fourth point then is to think about professional development support for teachers, and really there are 2 or 3 threads to this. First is around technical tools, so picking a finite set of technical tools, so recommending a small number of tools to get to grips with, and providing support and training for staff upon those. What we've found is that if you are using the Microsoft stack, then building around Office 365 and Teams and OneNote is probably the way forward to avoid overcomplicating things, and integration is solid. And likewise, if you are using G Suite, using Google Meet in conjunction with Classroom and Google Docs and Slides, etc., overcomes many of the issues around integration and workflow. If you haven't got a learning platform, I would strongly encourage you to investigate that. If you search on the Key for School Leaders, the DfE are providing support for setup, financial support and training around getting established with either Google's G Suite or Microsoft's stack. But there are other options out there such as Shobi and tools on Apple platforms such as Classroom that could do a similar job. Next thing that's important, I think, are case studies. So we've said what the tools might look like and how they would operate, but what does that look like in the context of science or the context of English or the context of history? So one of the things we've done on our teaching and learning website at Sandringham called Standardogy, that is publicly accessible, is to post a regular series of updates and case studies from teachers about what works and what doesn't work in their subject. So what does it look like when we are using particular techniques and tools in science or in languages or in history? And really think that helps exemplify for teachers about how they could use the tool in terms of their teaching, not just about how they could use it from a technical skills point of view. And then the third thread is really about thinking about the normal processes of good teaching and how they can be adjusted or replicated within the virtual world. So it is a little different when you can't get non-verbal cues and you can't look across a classroom to understand around engagement and the amount that is being taken in when you don't have the visual cues and the other aspects that we can wander around easily and look at work that's being undertaken in written form. So how can we adjust to take account of that? So it's really about thinking about, direct instruction is quite crucial in setting up a remote environment. Just posting set a PowerPoint with embedded instructions or a list of tasks on Google Classroom is probably less effective than having a short video or live introduction to explain to students what the tasks are and to really go through that, break that down in a little bit more detail. We find that students, if they're given just a set of text-based instructions 5 times a day, they sometimes struggle to access and to really understand what they're being asked to do. Thinking about questioning, so we've had to make adjustments in remote learning to things like when they are on a live session, using the chat function, only enabling microphone or camera when instructed to do so by the teacher, but also things like shared collaborative spaces, things like Padlet or a shared Google Doc can be helpful in getting students to not only answer questions but to pose questions of their own and to really indicate where they have misunderstood or they need some support and help. And then finally, thinking about assessment and feedback, I think it's probably fair to say that in most cases electronic forms of marking and feedback are possibly more time consuming than written manual paper-based feedback. However, there are things that you can do to try and overcome this. So things like using comment banks or rubrics in Google Classroom, or some of our teachers have used annotation tools and styluses and iPads to be able to make manual annotations on student work. Thinking about then approaches that foster student collaboration and peer feedback can be a time saver for teachers as well. So just like in a normal classroom, you can encourage self-assessment and peer assessment and providing digital frameworks and scaffolds to help students do that. And then at a whole school level, thinking about having someone responsible for leading on remote learning. So thinking about tracking tools and updates that are available and disseminating those to staff, thinking about new developments, and we're supposed driving forward the strategy and the professional learning support for staff. But a crucial point here is being cognizant of the fact that we need to cater for different start points and different confidence levels among staff, and really having champions that lead on EdTech within each faculty is a good idea, because again, if you've got someone who is comfortable within English talking about workflow around essays and rubrics and marking in Google Classroom, it's probably more effective for that person to disseminate and train members of the English faculty rather than that being done centrally by a non-specialist. Remote teaching is different, so there are some really good resources out there around helping to make those adjustments. So you may see there that as part of the remote work and the research work that the Education Endowment Foundation have done, they've put together various frameworks and resources to help. So thinking about how to structure a remote lesson in terms of activating prior learning, explanations, providing opportunities for practice, providing opportunities for reflection, and then a review process. So, not much different potentially to a in-class lesson, but it needs to be given some consideration of how to use the right tools and to do that remotely. Mark Esner as well has come up with some 5-point model in terms of delivering that he's published on a blog on the TES that is worth checking out, and that's using Rosenshine's principles around modelling, scaffolding, questioning, etc. To support learning, and also asking staff their experiences of what works. So as well as subject-specific case studies, just asking staff to write a blog or record a short video about their experience of remote learning, and some do's and don'ts can really help shorten the learning path for teachers when they're trying to adjust to this new world. Next consideration is clearly communicating expectations. So if you are making adjustments to a timetable or you're collapsing a timetable, how can students and parents access this, and how is it clear which staff are allocated to this new timetable as well? It is not uncommon that students claim that they don't know what they have to do next because they're looking in the wrong place, so they don't understand the instructions. So being absolutely clear about this is important. Also identifying which lessons are synchronous and they need to be there logged in at a specific time versus those that are asynchronous is important. Managing the school day at home is tricky, especially in families where there might be multiple siblings of different ages. And we also don't want to deny the well-being aspects of being able to go out for exercise with one's wider family, or to take lunch together, or whatever it might be. So giving students some visibility on when they need to be logged in and when they can choose when to do the additional work. Think about when the work is released. What we find is that student self-regulation is more difficult when work is given in large chunks. So I know some schools were giving out work booklets in chunks of a week or a fortnight, and that is more difficult for students to really plan their days and to sustain motivation through larger pieces. So what we've come up with at our school is that we tend to release the work at the start of each day. But in some cases, some schools are taking the opportunity to align it with their timetable. So work is released when that timetable period starts. And the expectation is that it's handed in either at the end of that session or probably more helpfully at the end of the day. So recognizing that students work at different paces, and it may be that they can't complete the classwork within the time window given. So to give them some additional time, at the end of the school day or the next day seems to make some sense. And then finally, just linking to the e-safety aspects, developing a virtual learning code of conduct and making sure that is shared with both students and staff and parents to make sure that they're brought into it. Now we've looked at assessing risk, and as a school we've determined that there's no more additional risk to staff from remote learning compared to at school, because at our school students already have learning devices with cameras and recording facilities, and we manage that through our normal behaviour management system. So really we've simply extended that to the home setting as well, and just made it clear around what's acceptable and what's not, and sanctions will flow if breaches of the code of conduct are made. Clearly you'll have to think about that in your own context at school, and where you feel the line is between acceptable risk and the benefits of remote learning versus unacceptable risk, and you may have to take a slightly different approach. Thinking then about engagement, so it needs to be easy for staff to monitor and track engagement of students. So at Sandringham we haven't asked staff to take a lesson by lesson register, which they normally would do within the in-class context, but easy ways of working out whether students engage or not are things like a self-marking quiz at the start of each lesson. So using something like Quizlet or quizzes can quickly indicate whether students have signed in or not. Video lessons, so we've used, at this school we've used Google Meet, and we have an extension available that simply captures those that have signed into a video lesson, just records that in a spreadsheet. But things like asking students to submit work as well, and you can quite clearly tell if they haven't submitted an assignment that's been set on Classroom. The learning platforms themselves can report on activity, so you can get through administrative support, things like how many students have signed in, how many video lessons have been, but also when the last sign-in has been for specific students. So if you're worried about students not engaging at all, you should be able to determine that from the reports from the learning platform. And how we've designed it here is that staff will record on a shared spreadsheet, a shared area, where there are students who are regularly not engaging and not handing in work and not attending lessons that are scheduled lessons. And those that aren't engaging are followed up by the pastoral staff. so either the attendance staff or the heads of year. And what we found that's been supported by the research is that an SMS message or a phone call home has got the most impact. Emailing students and emailing parents has less of an impact, but if a parent gets a text message to say that their young person is not attending school, virtual school that day, that seems to have the desired effect. Thinking about how to support self-regulation for students, so equipping them with some coaching and some skills around this. So this may be as part of a PSHE type lesson or a tutorial type session where the tutor can help around things like time management and managing workload and planning. That can help support their academic learning as well. But there also needs to be a recognition that home lies very enormously, and clearly we've got to be mindful and sensitive to some families have encountered tragedy due to the virus. Some families have got parents who are at home and maybe furloughed or maybe made redundant, and some families are key workers where they are not at home and not able to support their students in terms of their learning. So we've got to be mindful of that, and hence why contact through pastoral teams has been the approach we've taken here, because the pastoral leaders are aware of the difficulties that different families and different students may face, and are mindful of tailoring the approach to be sensitive to that. So linking to that really is, don't forget about these social and pastoral needs. Learning is a social experience, so having some contact with teachers is important, particularly since we've been out of school now for 3 months. But also think about less structured time with peers. So I know a lot of schools have been doing things like assemblies, but we also have offers here such as virtual choirs, art competitions. We are running a virtual sports day. There are lots of kind of engaging activities that are linked to things like the house competition, quizzes, and our tutors often in their tutorial periods will simply have, facilitate a bit of a discussion amongst the class, and maybe play some games, and really to try and make students feel included in school life and still in touch with their peers, because the young people are missing their friends. Worth also thinking about students being influenced and thinking about behavioural science here. And in the link there, I've pointed towards a blog by Harry Fletcher Wood, just thinking about social norms and where you can organise this so that remote learning is seen as normal, and participation engagement is a habit and it's just the thing that we do. Then you're more likely for the students to go along with that and to have higher engagement and higher attendance. And then finally, giving some considerations for specifically for pupil premium and SEND and other vulnerable students. I know many of our schools have had these young people on site to be able to give them some support, but there are other considerations that need to be brought to bear for remote learning as well. Mark Rowland from the Uni Research School is an expert here. So again, I've put the link in there to Mark's guidance around thinking through the lens of disadvantaged students. And the Sandringham Research School has had a interview with Mark recently on our podcast. So if you check that out, the Sandringham Research School, you'll find some good advice from Mark about dealing with pupil premium students. Setting plans in place is difficult, tiring, but the one thing that needs to be is not set in stone. It needs to be responsive as things change, and as we know, guidance from the DfE can change in a heartbeat with little notice. So one suggestion is to consider dividing the plan into phases, and there can be a period of review and adjustment at the end of each phase. This helps to break up what can seem like quite a significant extended time period for students into smaller chunks of, we will be operating the virtual learning curriculum for 2 weeks in this way, then a holiday, then the next 3 weeks, then a break, and so on. And that can help sustain motivation across longer time periods, but also just force that reflection, review, and make any adjustments that are necessary. Surveying staff and students and parents, reasonably regularly, can be as simple as an online form to ask them for how they're getting on, and are there any things that they want more of or less of. You've always got to be mindful of the fact that students will say that they are receiving far too much work, and parents will probably say that they're doing far too little, and the true path is somewhere in between the two. Getting that Goldilocks amount of work just right is difficult, and it will probably differ for each year group. But I think accept the fact that pleasing 100% of the time, 100% of the people 100% of the time is impossible. There are different stakeholders with different needs that are sometimes conflicting, and reconciling all those into a coherent plan is part of the challenge. But it's probably not possible to be perfect, because our schools simply aren't set up for an environment where we don't have 30 students in the classroom on site for significant periods during the week, and we're all doing best efforts basis. Do review what other schools are doing, but follow the course that's best for your individual context, and don't be afraid to explain to parents and governors that just because school X down the road is doing something, it doesn't mean that it's possible or beneficial to do them in this context. I know there's been a lot of comparisons between well-resourced private schools versus state schools and what we're able to offer in the different sectors. But these type of comparisons are generally unhelpful, and really guiding people towards what's appropriate for learners in your context with the facilities and resources and skills that you've got available is key. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of general advice. Just to talk very briefly about Sandringham's virtual curriculum. It's probably different to what many schools around the country are able to sustain, because we started with the position where every student has access to an electronic learning device that they would normally bring to school as part of the Bring Your Own Device program. So we didn't start with the same digital divide that other schools may face. And this is a well-embedded program that we've had devices and iPads and tablets at school for since 2014. So we've had 6 years plus of experience with remote learning and blended learning. Use of Google Classroom is already well established, but that has obviously ramped up to be our main conduit, alongside Google Meet, which we had less experience of. But people have got to grips with that, and we were fortunate enough to have time just before the lockdown to train staff quickly on how to use Google Meet. We divided our plan into 4 phases with review points around each of the holidays, so the time leading up to Easter, the May half term, etc. And we have come up with a different approach for each year group that I'll talk about in a second. But if you want more information about what our virtual learning curriculum looks like, the link to our website is there. So this is what we've come up with in terms of our different year groups and a different approach. So for year 7 and 8, we are following the normal timetable structure, but we have reduced the number of lessons in core subjects. And this is really a function of staff availability and resourcing. 5 sessions a day for every year 7 and 8 student just wasn't possible. So we ensure that every student has got some synchronous live lessons, but faculties are encouraged to set extended pieces of work or projects that can span multiple lessons. And really our goal here for year 7 and 8 is around 2 to 3 hours of learning per day averaged out across the week. But because it follows the timetable structure, that might be a bit spiky with some days being heavier than others. But this is one of the trade-offs that we've had to make. Year 9 is a fuller timetable with more live lessons, and all core subjects are delivering each lesson, but we have removed options after May half term for those students that aren't carrying them forward to GCSE. So if you're studying GCSE geography next year, you still have your geography lesson, but if you're not, you don't. And time is created from that. For year 10 and 12, it is following the timetable fairly closely, so a mix again of live lessons and asynchronous lessons. And although we haven't set homework for Key Stage 3, we have set homework for year 10 and 12. And there are regular checks in and assess work from teachers and feedback. And we've taken advantage of the ability to have year 10 and 12 on site for a learning review with tutors from the week beginning the 15th of June. And there is some subject specialist teaching in small groups, but in reality, the default mode of delivery for year 10 and 12 continues to be remote learning. And we made this determination that rather than only being able to have in 25% of the students, each day across 4 days, with the other students then having less provision, we were better able to sustain provision across both year groups by continuing to operate the remote curriculum pretty much as is, and then having short contacts in person with tutors spread out across the next week or two. For year 11 and 13, we decided very quickly that there was no point in doing further exam-related work after the lockdown, We have issued bridging work, and there is, particularly for year 11, they will be issued with sixth form summer work to do in the induction day at the end of June. And for year 13, we provided enrichment work leading them towards undergraduate degrees or college courses in particular subjects. So this tends to be more of the film, book, website, things like future learn courses that might be relevant to their future study. But that is all, it's up to those students to self-regulate. We've had tutors have contact with students and have things like assemblies with those groups, but there's been less direction of their work, as it's up to them to engage that enrichment work. And finally, I suppose wrapping around this are things like ideas around exercise, assembly program. We have got remote careers guidance, things like virtual choirs, dance, wellbeing resources for students and staff, and then specific support for SEND and pupil premium students. And that includes both a mix of on-site support, so working with our teaching assistants on-site in terms of catch-up, but also remote support, so more frequent phone calls and check-ins from support workers for those particular students. Okay, so some closing advice then is keep it simple, build from your starting point and don't overcomplicate the tech. You'll alienate staff and students and parents if it's too difficult, too much to manage too quickly. Build slowly, seek regular feedback, don't be afraid to change direction. So building in review points is sensible, because then you can say, when we get up to phase 2, we may make some changes, and then communicating those clearly to parents, students and staff is important. You do need to make an adjustment to pedagogy in terms of remote learning, and do share ideas on this and case studies, and train staff on this as well as just the technical tools. So because this is a new pedagogy, a new way of working where we don't have the students sat in front of us. And then monitoring and supporting student and parental engagement is another important factor of making sure that we're able to sustain this over the medium and longer term.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Simon. I can see you've published a question there, and I think Fergal's probably alluded to some of the answers in this as he went on talking in that presentation. But yeah, so what would be top 5 recommendations for this? So certainly within our context, I think chunking the learning has been quite important, and by that I mean on most things like Google Classroom, you can schedule tasks to come out. So rather than sending it in one large PDF or having all of the work in one place for the whole day, for some subjects, especially the more technical subjects, potentially chunk the learning so that it comes out during the lesson. So you can time it so it comes, one bit comes out start lesson, one comes out a little bit later, always bearing in mind the speed that some of the most able students are going to be working at. Also, and Fergal spoke about this quite a lot, encourage kind of self-regulated learning as well. There's lots of opportunities for students to do retrieval practice, things like quizzes in Quizlet, and it could also help them to build good study habits as well. Try and keep some kind of sense of community. So, for example, having some kind of forums or chat forums, I think is really important, and peer support could be really good as well. So, one of the tools that our maths department use is ClassKick. We are going to have a webinar on that in a couple of weeks, actually, but I think that's been really useful, and it lets students help each other and students ask for help. And also build in informative assessments, so you know how well the students are doing, and you can easily do that again through designing self-marking multiple choice quizzes. You do need to consider how you're designing those questions and what we call the distractors, and making sure you're not making them too easy. You might get a false sense of security from that, but yeah, designing multiple choice questions really carefully, but doing those regularly to get some feedback. And also just being on hand for emails from students when they're stuck, and have some synchronous elements where you can as well. So even if it's a check-in, a 5-minute check-in, a 10-minute check-in, I think it helps to keep that sense of community going. And Fergal spoke there quite a lot about seeking feedback from parents and students as well. Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Yeah, really interesting to hear what other schools have done as well. And as Fergal said, it's really important to think about your context and what's going to work best for you. So you're right, 90-minute lessons at Key Stage 4, good, and 1 hour at Key Stage 3, separate from the normal timetable. Okay, really interesting. Thank you. Any other? Let's just switch back to the chat window. Any other questions at this point? Do you mind repeating the name of the app for your maths department? Yeah, so the app that's called Class Kick. So it's essentially a series of slides that you can create. It makes a copy for every student and they can work through it. But if they get stuck, they can put their hand up and the student can record messages to them to help them. They can go on and help them live. But also you can enable peer support as well. Now, even before lockdown, maths were using that for support. So, for example, setting a task for homework, and instead of taking the books in, marking them, handing them back, and that elapsed time between the students doing the work and them getting their feedback, quite often the night before it was due in, faculty staff would be on Class Kick supporting students and giving them that feedback on their work straight away. It saves time with marking, so teachers are able to do it right away, the marking there. They're not sitting in front of a pile of books. They're able to do it as soon as the work comes in. And they can do it by recording as well, so you can add voice notes onto there. So instead of having to type lots, and it can be effective, particularly for some students, to be able to record that feedback. So yeah, that app's called Class Kick. Class Kick. Yeah, and Jamboard is great as well, Michael. Yeah, I've used Jamboard a lot. It's a bit different to Class Kick. Class Kick, you produce your presentation and the students all work through a copy of the presentation for themselves, whereas Jamboard, you can have those collaborative boards, and that's fantastic. And quizzes as well. There's a lot of pre-made content from other teachers that you can take and adapt in that for live lessons. That's absolutely fantastic. Another one I use is Socrative, but that's good for live sessions, but you don't have the pre-created content. A lot of these apps that we're talking about here are in our formative assessment and retrieval practice webinar as well. So we've got that coming up again in the not too distant future. Let me just see if I can find that. Yeah, so in the towards the bottom there, Friday the 10th of July, 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. So there's now a long webinar there, and that looks at a lot of these tools that we're talking about now. Fantastic. Are there any other questions now before we finish? Okay, so I'm going to finish there. I will send you the last video through via email, and that's just looking at the case studies, but I'll also give you a link to the case studies so you can have a look at those also. We've got several webinars coming up. We've got some quite practical ones that will be relevant and useful for classroom teachers, both at primary and secondary phase. So, for example, getting started with G Suite. We've got iPad tips for teachers has happened, but that's online. So a recording of that webinar is available online on our webinars page on Sandagodji. And like I said, we've got the digital tools for formative assessment coming up. And I'm just about to add another one looking at Class Kick. That's going to be on the Monday of the last day of term. I think, looking at the date there, off the top of my head, that's going to be, I think it's the 4th. Is it the 14th? But yeah, the Monday of the last week of term, we do have Class Kick webinar from one of our maths teachers, and so I think that'll be really interesting. Any other questions just before we finish? I can see someone's typing, so I'll just wait a moment. Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay, so I'll finish there. Please do get in touch with us if you'd like to. And just a reminder to sign up for the EdTech Demonstrator program. This is the page that you would go to. You can find out about all of the upcoming webinars. So these are just our webinars from Sandringham, but there are now about 40 schools nationally as part of this program, and they're running webinars on a range of different topics. But also you can then engage with the school for a half term for them to help you with your strategy and provide professional learning directly to your staff, for example. Okay. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon. When I finish the webinar, there is it will take you to a feedback form, I hope. If it doesn't, I'll email it out to you, but I think it will take you to a feedback form. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment, because there's an opportunity there to ask for what you'd like to see in future webinars. This one's quite focused on strategy. For kind of SLT and leaders in school, people who are leading remote learning and blended learning. But we do have some much more practical ones as well for classroom teachers, and we're looking to schedule some more subject-specific sessions in, and some looking at particular SEND as well. So please do let us know in that form what you would like to see in future webinars. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon, and have a good evening.